Oh, sorry, that jumped through. Welcome if you're just joining us. I can see that there's still a few more people joining, but I think we'll probably get started.
Yeah.
Should we get started?
Yeah.
We've already introduced ourselves. So this is the first of 3 sessions, and we will give you links to the other sessions as we go through, but we'll also pop them in the chat so that if you haven't signed up or haven't been aware that we're also doing some sessions on other topics, you'll be able to find those out as we go through.
Okay, so good morning to everyone. Thank you very much for joining us. We are delighted to have everyone here. Well, that's
sorry.
forward,
I don't know why it's getting
you've got one job. So we first want to kind of tell you a little bit about us and why we are doing these sessions, but more importantly, why we set up Breaking Binaries Research, which is our sort of branded research program, within which we have multiple different projects that have sort of are set under the same principles and same aim, which is to explore diverse identities at work and use advanced qualitative methods to start to build and continue to build on better, more informed research around diverse identities. So often what you'll find is that generally when any discussion of identities, and particularly diverse identities, it tends to simplify it because it makes it easy for us to understand and also as academics to write about. We don't really feel that that is the best way going forward in order to inform and make true change within the context of work, which is where our interest lies. We really have to focus on the methods that we use, the data we collect and how we collect that data, and more importantly, how we analyze that data, which is our focus today, and the way in which that informs what the knowledge that we create fundamentally. So you can see here we've got a number of different research projects that sit under the Breaking Binaries umbrella. We also have a number of fantastically awesome doctoral researchers that sit within our lab, the Prilliams lab, and they are all looking into various aspects of, what are you laughing at, the Prilliams lab? It's an excellent term.
It always makes me laugh.
It's like a Hollywood duo, but less money making, less photogenic. So we set this up, and our PhD students look sort of broadly within topics that sit under the umbrella, and we've got a number of them joining us today. So hello guys, great to see your faces. So these projects, for example, we've got a funded project by the CIPD, the Chartered Institute for Personnel and Development, which is currently looking at the disclosure of stigmatized identities within small and medium-sized businesses. So we're currently involved with that, and we've got a big workforce questionnaire, qualitative questionnaire out at the moment, collecting as much data as we can to really understand how individuals who have diverse identities or have experienced and self-identify with diverse and complex identities, how they experience disclosure at work. So that's us. We have a fantastic blog. Is that okay? Yeah. So we have a fantastic blog, which you can check out. We also do some teaching amongst all of this. We have a fantastic podcast, but today is all about advanced qualitative methods, and particularly a focus on narrative analysis. We also, within that, have a number of other sessions that we are running.
I'm so sorry.
Do you know what? This happened to me the other week.
I don't know why. It's just jumping on one all the time. Many apologies.
This is why we're not Hollywood yet. So we've
not
got
even Paul.
So we've got narrative methods today, and then the next 2 training sessions we're focusing on. The next one on research interview training. Real focus on that is I have a particular passion for interview and how to conduct really good interviews. I don't think there's enough training on offer, or particularly good training on offer, for qualitative researchers, and particularly with a sort of a focus interviews moving online, which actually we've done a lot of with our own research. We really want to focus on developing those key research interview skills to help you collect the best data possible, because obviously you're only as good as the data you have. And then finally, on the 12th of June, we've got an online training session which focuses much more on qualitative data coding and analysis. So which is kind of the first stage of all analytic methods, really. So it's focusing on building those skills as to what to expect when and how to code data well. And then, you know, that will help you develop skills depending on what analytic method you choose to move forward with from there.
And in that, we're going to demonstrate using a free open source macro, not that one that we've developed. It's Babbage and Terry's open source macro, which you can use in Word to code your data. So if you've looked at NVivo, or like me, used NVivo in the past and deciding that it's far too much effort, this will give you an alternative way at looking at how to code data.
And you can sign up to all of those, obviously, from our blog as well. All this information's on our blog.
And there's if you're external to Swansea University, there is thanks to Alice, a Google sign up form, so we can send you all the details.
Okay, so now we'll focus more on what's happening today.
I'm not touching it. I swear, I am not touching it.
And all of you are here really to find out a little bit more about narratives. Some of you may have already used narrative approaches in your own work. And really, we'll start with a really simple question called focusing on what narrative is. Now, as we unpack that question, you will slowly see that just asking that perceivably simple question is not so simple at all. We'll then focus on really talking about understanding the similarities and differences between narratives, stories, and discourse, and other forms of communication and modes of communication that are involved, both at the everyday level and also in other forms of data that we might come across as researchers. The key point to remember here is that there is not one approach to narrative analysis, and often this is a mistake that people make when they sort of come forth into the world of narrative analysis and beyond, is that there's one approach. And it can be really challenging for doctoral researchers, indeed people doing MSCs as well. Some of you might be doing your master's dissertations and research.
And more experienced researchers.
And more experienced researchers that, you know, there is very limited advice really, and coherent advice, or one simple book that you can pick up that tells you how to do it, which is sometimes just all you want. How do I do this? Tell me, what stages do I need to follow to do this? And there are lots of different types of narrative analysis that come from different epistemological and ontological positions, but then they also have lots of crossovers and similarities as well. So we've listed 5 here that we'll be exploring in today's session specifically. But
we're also going to walk through some examples based on a research paper, not actually from Breaking Binaries, but research that I published with Gillian Simon last year. And we're going to walk through sort of, I think it's 4 actual analytic examples as well. So, you know, there isn't an easy to do recipe at the end of this, but hopefully by walking through these 4 different approaches to narrative analysis, looking at key challenges, and then unpacking some examples, you'll hopefully get a good starting point to be able to explore in your own research.
And I think the key point to remember through this is that what an analytic approach you choose will be dependent on all sorts of different factors, the main one being your own research question, and also the position at which you're coming from your research from. And you have, I think what the kind of message we want to get across today is that you have to be very careful what analytic approach you choose, because some may constrict you in ways which mean you won't be able to answer your research question depending on the approach that you're taking.
So let's start with the question that what is narrative? And so, I put some slides, some images up here, because I think often we think about narrative as text, and obviously historically there's been a very strong oral tradition of storytelling and narrative as well. But it also, and today, narrative can be, analysis can apply to all sorts of different forms of story and narrative. So you've got here examples of graphic comics, you've got tweets, you've got images, you've got an official document illustrated usefully by the Swansea University Staff Communications Weekly Roundup. which we rely on heavily for all our information about the university. So there are all sorts of different things that you can analyse when we start talking about narrative. And we just wanted to put that out here at the start, because what you will see both through the examples that we use and in some of the way that we talk about narrative, we're not always talking about interview data when we talk about narrative analysis. There are lots of things that you can look at, and elsewhere, and perhaps we should add this to our to-do list, we have done, and you will find it on our blog, an introduction to visual analysis video, because that is also can be used in conjunction with narrative analysis when you're looking at these different communication modes. But before we wanted to go any further, we wanted you to meet each other. We've now got 40 people on
Hello,
the session.
everybody.
So sorry for those who've joined us a little bit after the start, but you haven't missed too much so far. So we're going to pop you into breakout rooms for just a very short amount of time, because there's so many of you. We can't, someone's dropped off because we've mentioned breakout rooms. We can't have you all introduce yourselves, but we will literally just pop you into breakout rooms for about 5 minutes, no more than that, might even be slightly less than that, with a few people. I'll have to do some maths in a minute, but no more than sort of 4 or 5 people, so you can just say hello and meet some other people on the call. Do you want to do this?
Because there's nothing like a forced exchange on a Friday morning.
Do you want to do that?
What, put them into breakout
Yes.
rooms?
No, you have to do it on here.
Oh, okay. Breakout rooms, sign
We've
automatically.
got 40.
So what groups? So how many?
Yeah, do that.
Yeah.
We're gonna one less actually, because first.
Okay.
Right, we're going to pop you into breakout rooms, and we're just, the purpose of this is just to say hello to other people on the call and tell them a little bit about your research and your interest in narrative. We're going to do that now, and we'll just leave you in there for 3 or 4 minutes. Open rooms. You should now be moving to breakout rooms. Yay.
Then.
guess it's 60 sessions anyway, then, isn't it? Okay, everyone's now returning from the breakout rooms. Hopefully that gave you an opportunity to at least meet some of the other people that are on the session, because with so many, it's nice to make some contacts and to learn a little bit more about others' research. And we'll just give Zoom the normal time to exit everybody from the breakout rooms back into the main session.
So with your introductions to each other, it's worth reflecting on the way you choose to introduce yourself, what language you choose to use, how you set yourself up to other people, thinking about the other people in the room. When you hear somebody else talking, do you mediate the things that you say? So all of these things are worth reflecting on in terms of your own experiences and how you start to construct your own narratives about yourself.
So let's get moving then and talk about narrative. What is it? I quite like, I can only apologise for the fact that for some reason Zoom is jumping forward the slides the whole time.
But you will see Katrina get flustered at every slide.
So that is the story of this.
It is.
Of this session. I quite like Toulan's definition of a narrative as recounting of things spatio-temporally distant. Because it brings out three key facets about a narrative that we are usually interested in analytically. One, this notion of recounting things, and things is a gloriously vague term, which I think works quite well given what we've just talked about, different forms of narrative. So a recounting of things that essentially happened at some other place and time. And the where and when of where those things happened might be of analytical interest to you in your narrative. So while vague definitions can be frustrating, I think this one usefully highlights things that we need to be alert to analytically. And then we have Yanis Gabriel's slightly more fulsome definition, which many of you may be familiar with, who starts to talk about culture as fundamentally narrative, and that they are essentially narratives are part of our lives, and that they are how we construct our own story as we move through not just our research but other aspects of our lives. So you will find that there are loads of definitions out there. I've just selected these two, and we perhaps for those of you that come from other fields or other areas of studies, it should be said that we both sit in the management school, and therefore we've particularly used examples from organisation studies through this session, although the origin, as we'll start to explore a little later on, of narrative analysis obviously predates the institution of the business school and the field of org studies. So narrative analysis has been used in organisation studies across all sorts of different I don't know why it's doing this, all sorts of different research areas. And whether you are in this field or another field, then it's always useful to understand, just as you would explore in a literature review, the research from a sort of topic perspective, to look at your field from a methodological perspective and understand how, or indeed if, narrative analysis has been used in the areas that you are researching. You will always find that it has a particular home in certain core topics, and you may discover other topics where narrative analysis doesn't appear at all. And it's always interesting to explore, therefore, how that has shaped the understanding of those topics in your field. So fundamentally, the answer to the question, what is narrative, as Helen's already helpfully alluded to at the start, depends very much on your ontological and epistemological positioning. And I know that for many of you, if you're a PGR student and you are being asked to write a theoretical framework chapter, you are no doubt battling with the terms ontology and epistemology. But it really is about how we position ourselves as researchers, how we believe we can, how we see the world, and how we believe we can understand it. As I've already mentioned, many different fields of inquiry have different approaches, and we will explore some of those later on. But it's also really important to think about cultural traditions and historical perspectives, particularly where there are more oral traditions of narrative and storytelling. And I've put a reference there for a great book on Indigenous research methods, where there is much more sensitivity and understanding of very different cultural traditions about storytelling. And those can be really useful, and obviously are critical depending on where you are situated. Given we're in Wales, one could say that we should pay more attention to the poets, the Welsh poets perhaps, and look at how poetry has been significant form of narrative and storytelling within Wales, and there will be others that might depend on your own particular location. Are you going to chip in?
Am I going to chip in?
Do chip in.
I think that it's worth, particularly to those of you that are seeking to do work in sort of post-colonial or decolonized research, or even in the areas of work that we work in, that additional layer of really thinking about the where that language you're using has been constructed from. Does it have a Western lens? Does it have an Eastern lens? Because the devices of narrative in terms of how narratives are constructed vary hugely depending on the languages that underpin them and the construction of the languages that underpin them. So, you know, if you are collecting or thinking of collecting data beyond sort of the Western centric powerhouses that we often see within research, then these are particular understandings that I would say are really imperative when you're conducting forms of narrative analysis, no matter what type of analysis, narrative analysis you're choosing to use.
So as already mentioned, that we can define narrative as being part of our everyday existence. And it's what's been used to help us make sense of the world, and as a basis for understanding how things happen long before the scientific method, of course. It is actually rather a fundamental construct around lots of qualitative data, whether that's visual, textual, or material. And it's part of our data that we think about in terms of how we form our own understanding of what we're doing as research. It also can be an approach to actually analysing communication. So narrative is all of these things. It doesn't have to be all of these things in your research, though, but it's really useful to try and pin down or think about these broader ideas when you start a narrative research project. There are lots of different perspectives around, but they do have some similarities. Now, this is really giving meaning to the one step forward, two steps back, isn't it? So firstly, that when we're talking about narrative, we employ some ideas from linguistics, as you'll see, depending on the approach you take, but that it is more than the syntax and the linguistic components of a particular telling. So there is more to narrative than just linguistic analysis. We are not linguists, and I have stopped short of going as far as introducing conversation analysis, for example, because we'd already got 4 that we're going to work through. So we're not discussing conversation analysis today. And conversation analysis is much more concerned with syntax and linguistics and turn taking and the constructs associated with those. Narrative is often in our data grounded in a specific telling, for example, in an interview, but it's also about how that specific telling reconstructs wider understandings of the issue that we're interested in. You can look at narrative through a number of different modes, and you need to make decisions in your research about which modes you are going to be looking at. It's very difficult to look at, well, it's not very difficult to look multimodally, but we'll talk a little bit more about the challenges of that later. And we'll talk about how narrative is situated. Maybe you're looking at a particular organization or a particular part of an organization or a particular event in which narrative will be situated, but that because of this reconstruction with wider understandings, it's never completely bound. There is quite a lot of agreement actually amongst all the different forms of narrative analysis that narratives are temporal and they involve sequencing. This idea of retelling that we introduced at the beginning involves some sort of storied effect of time. And therefore, it won't surprise you that the examples that I'm going to use later are actually from a paper where we were interested in temporality. So narrative is often used in research where time is particularly important, and they involve some sort of sequencing. And I will explain as we go through and get into the detail of this particular approaches, some of the arguments about sequencing and whether you need to have a particular sequence for something to count as a narrative. So these are the things that there are quite a lot of similarities around the different perspectives of narrative analysis, but there are also key differences. The first one relates to ontological and epistemological standing, and how and whether notions of truth and or fiction are relevant. Some time ago, I did some research using looking at online narratives, and I remember we used to take this data to conferences, and regularly I'd be asked, but how do you know what someone wrote on that blog is true? And my answer to that, because I was taking a social constructionist position, was it really doesn't matter whether it is true or not. It is the effect of the narrative that I'm interested in and how it is constructed. There are also differences in understanding the role of the researcher and participants. And narrative analysis really does ask us and require us to look at this in quite a sophisticated way and think about narrative as a performance. Who is the storyteller, for example, and who is the audience, and how do those roles change? So, for example, today, when I talk you through the examples, I'm the storyteller, I'm the one recounting the event. And yet, in the telling that I experienced in the interviews, I would have said I was the audience and the participant was the storyteller. So it's important to think about how those change. Different analytic approaches are interested in the sort of analytic crux of the narrative, and hopefully that will be come a bit clearer as we go through. And while I said that temporality is pretty universal in terms of narrative analysis, there is an argument that to count as a narrative, you should be able to identify the conclusion, the end, the coda. There must be a sort of so what to the story, whereas others would say narratives are always unfolding. There is never an end. And I think that hopefully will become a bit clearer as well as we talk through the examples. You can sometimes have a sort of provisional ending or provisional conclusion to a specific telling, but the story itself will go on. And there is, depending on your positioning, more interest in either what holds narratives together, what makes narratives similar, and how can we understand narratives as a particular form versus versus interest in anti-narrative, which has come more from a post-structural, what I'm today calling post-structural-ish perspective, because that's quite a wide view, an interest in anti-narrative and how stories are disrupted.
And there's some interesting, in terms of anti-narrative as well, Katrina's points make around how temporality and often time is such a distinct feature in the way that narratives are employed. There is some really interesting and great work that looks at the privileging of time and the Western constructions of time, and that particularly in the decolonized and the post-colonial work. There's some really interesting work which looks at that anti-narrative and how it disrupts these real kind of Western understandings of time and how time is used as a tool to govern us all in particular ways, in particular contexts, like now in this presentation.
Okay, so we've talked a little bit about what is narrative, different views on that question. And now we're just going to pause before we go into the meat of the session and talk through different approaches to talk about narrative, stories, discourse, and what I've rather called
Post-structural-ish.
No, we're in other communicative modes, because depending on your depending on who you read, you will find quite specific differences in how narrative, stories, discourse, and other labelled modes of communication are talked about, and it can be very confusing. And I guess for those of you that are PGR students, this will be another one of those slightly frustrating discussions where there's no simple answer. And what matters particularly is how you are using the terms and the way in which you deploy them analytically. You can use them in any of the ways that the authors suggest, or indeed come up with your own way. But as long as there is a consistent conceptual framework around that you define in your research, then that's okay.
I think that also goes for experience, those who are, postdoc and beyond, when you're constructing your papers, etc., that clarity is really clear. And so often, I read papers which say they employ a form of narrative analysis that are not clear, or the type of narrative that they've chosen does not meet their, I would assume, because it's not always explicit, positioning of the research or indeed the researchers. So it's just about building that consistency and clarity into your work.
So the key difference that we're trying to highlight here is the way that authors either use story, narrative, discourse, and rhetoric particularly interchangeably. And a lot of authors do that, even authors writing methods books, in which case you have to be really clear in your work that either you're going to use them interchangeably, or you're using an umbrella term like narrative to stand for story, discourse, rhetoric, etc., and why you are doing that. Others put them in a hierarchy, and I'll give you some examples of this in a minute, particularly placing narrative and story, either story is above narrative, or conveniently narrative is above story. Authors do both, and some others differentiate them completely, give different definitions for different and different meanings for these terms. And it's annoyingly but unsurprisingly, once you've got into the methods world for a bit, individual authors also change their minds. So if you read something that someone's written, 2015 and something someone's written 2022, you might find that they've actually refined, shall we say, their argument. So, for example, I was quite surprised when I looked at the Routledge Handbook of Discourse Analysis published in 2023 to find that there, in a discourse handbook, we are now seeing chapters on narrative analysis methods. For quite some time, discourse analysis liked to position itself quite separately from narrative and story, and say that it was something slightly more, you know, the Foucauldian, the post-structuralist, the sort of power relations, Fairclough, etc., was something slightly different from narrative analysis. So there are sort of changes in positioning. And the second bullet point on here says that in much of the same way that discourse analysis has tried to continually position itself as being more than text and including visual and the material, etc. So narrative analysis is moving to consider contemporary and often digital narrative forms. So you can apply a narrative analysis approach to Twitter threads, for example, or to Instagram hashtags. So there is, these things do shift. So I didn't want to work through in detail all the different people and had the different ways that they position this. But on this slide, what I've done is provide some examples of positioning by different people so that you can see that. So Yanis Gabriel in the middle here, for example, who is very has a differentiation between narrative and story, and that story is a particular type of narrative, for example. It's, I think, if you're going to undertake narrative analysis, you do have to have an awareness of this broader debate. And Vara's work, for example, takes almost the opposite approach, so that narratives are fragments of stories rather than stories being fragments of narrative. So, but you will find lots of people that use these interchangeably, or, as I've said already, differentiate between them in one writing and then use them interchangeably in another. And somewhat inevitably, because I'm based in organisation studies, if you're in org studies, you will certainly reckon names like David Boget, Yanis Gabriel, for example. But of course, there will be a methodological tradition in your own field that you also need to consider. Some of these, Frank's work, for example, which I'm going to talk about in a little more detail in a minute, originates in psychology. So it is important to understand these positions, but don't get too bogged down by it. When I was doing my PhD and I did discourse analysis in my PhD, I called it discourse analysis, not narrative analysis. I spent a lot of time reading and fretting about finding the perfect methodological approach that fitted with my understanding of discourse analysis, before eventually giving up and realizing that I just had to set out what my approach was and reinforce that through the conceptual arguments that I was making in my theoretical framework. I didn't necessarily have to hang my hat on a named approach. Your own PhD supervisors may say something different, but when I examine a PhD, for example, I'm really interested in understanding the individual argument that the researcher is making for what they've done and why, not that they're just telling me they've done a particular named approach. Do you want to add anything at this point, Helen? While I take a sip of my nice cold coffee.
I think what many of you probably joined today thinking is that you'd go away with stages of narrative analysis and to be able to go and do that straight away. We will
some of that.
Get there eventually, but I think the point we want to emphasize is that you have to do a little bit of work beforehand. You know, when you're picking an analytic framework, it is not just about picking it off the shelf and going, this will do. It's about, this is a fundamental part of your research design and fundamental part that, you know, and probably, I would argue one of the most important parts, because it's where everything starts fitting together. And, you know, if you get your analytic framing right, you know, that will enable you to look at your data in a particular way that will then enable you to meet the research aim. So thinking about it, where this analytic framework and these analytic frameworks fit. So in essence, it does matter which one you choose, but what matters is that you choose one, you stick with it, and you're consistent with it in terms of how you employ it. That's what I would add.
Thank you very much. You're welcome. Slide hasn't jumped now. So we've given you a definition or we haven't given you a definition of narrative. We've given you lots. We've talked about this complicated difference between narratives, stories, and discourse and other communicative modes, and how different authors use them differently themselves, and the differences between them.
Can I just add one bit on that?
No.
Is that the differences lie in the positions that a lot of the authors come from. So, you know, the key kind of when you're thinking about differentiating narrative and discourse, for example, you'll find that a lot of the time when you're reading authors that come from a more Foucauldian perspective, the kind of post-structuralist perspective, they will see discourse as separate, generally, you know, more of a separation between discourse and narrative, and that discourse influences narrative in that way. So it's worth thinking about if you choose to kind of read these authors, then thinking about where they have, you know, where their homework's been done and what's influenced them, because that will then give you an idea of how they see the differences between discourse, narrative, and stories. Or again, that is also, you can see in some of the writings that it's collapsed as well. So just be kind of mindful of that, I'd say.
Okay, so we're now going to go through four different-ish approaches to narrative analysis, and spend a little, and then I'll go through some examples. Just to say that we've got a reference list on a slide at the end, and we'll also post that on our blog. So please don't worry about trying to write the names and the dates as I go through these. I haven't consulted any of these authors before I've labelled them in these ways, and it's very possible that they may not agree with the way I am labelling or describing their approaches. But I am hoping that it will give you a good starting point. They're not in any particular order, though perhaps I am starting with, I'm hesitant to say the more straightforward, but I am probably starting with the more straightforward approach and going on to the more complicated ones. But that doesn't mean that you might not use bits from these. Also, in terms of the detail that I'm giving you, I'm not repeating stuff. So some of the stuff that I will cover under the sort of more structural analysis, you probably also need to do as a starting point for some of the work later on. A bit like Helen said, we often start with coding our data, and we are going to talk a little bit about coding as well, and the challenges of doing that when you're doing narrative analysis a little bit later on. Right, so without further ado, before the slides jump forward and back, I'm going to start with linguistic structural analysis. I don't know, I put based in the main slide, but I'm just calling it linguistic structural analysis. So I said at the start I wasn't going to look at conversation analysis, and I'm not. Don't touch the things, you're making it worse, woman. But analysing the structural or components of narratives is often a starting point for much narrative analysis. Now, I've said on the slide this can become conversation analysis if you go down that route. I am not a conversation analyst. I don't have the linguistic training to do that. Conversation analysis is really into things like the detail of utterances, pauses, overlaps. I mean, really detailed linguistic analysis, which is not what we do. But I've mentioned here both monologues and polyphonic narratives and also dialogic. I couldn't remember the word for two people talking when I wrote this slide, but so that thinking about the form you have of narrative, if it's a singular voice, yourself as a researcher, perhaps with a dialogue in an interview, or perhaps more polyphonic. So when you get into things like focus groups, for example, it becomes really complicated but really interesting to unpack how narratives are built through multiple voices. So the first focus that you have in this sort of structural analysis is really trying to unpack the narrative form, often based, on linguistic work, looking at the structure of the story. So put simply, you're looking for the beginning, middle, and end of a story, and understand how that is built, either through an individual account, or particularly in polyphonic narratives, how that is built by people adding into the story. I'm sort of doing this with my hands to give the idea that people are layering stories. Now, it's important when you're doing this component analysis, not just to think of a story as a straightforward, or a narrative as a straightforward sequence. Obviously, it can involve dispute. If you've got polyphonic narratives, it can involve tangents. It can involve a lot of different ways in which the narrative works out, and you're often then looking at actors in their narrative production, understanding what roles are people playing in this narrative, how are they able, or who is able to, for example, conclude a story. If you've got a polyphonic narrator, who has the power to stop the story, to end the story, or to start the story? These are the sorts of things that you're able to do then in looking at the structural analysis. Now, many of these elements you will then see in the other forms that we are going to go through. And one I want to mention, and I will show you in the examples. Where's this going? Is something called conversational historic present tense, which sounds terribly fancy, but is basically reenactment. So it is when somebody tells you, you often find this in interviews, where someone will tell you the story by reenacting literally what people said. And it has a particular purpose, or can have a particular purpose, as establishing weight to the narrative, providing evidence in truth by bringing in alternate voices. And I will show you some examples of that when we go through. But that's something that I often use from linguistic structural analysis in my own narrative analysis, because it's really interesting to do that. But as you can see in polyphonic narratives, you're also interested in how people enroll others. So when you turn to someone and say, you remember that, don't you? You were there, weren't you, Helen? Tell me about, I won't get to say anything because it probably will be very gossipy. Or that they exclude them. So you're looking at narratives as a way of understanding the relations between the individuals in the group, often in that way. Please do put questions in the chat. We should have said this as we go through. We've gone through quite a lot.
Yeah.
So please pop your questions in the chat, because before we go through the examples, we will pause and pick up those questions.
No, you finish that point and I'll.
No, that was the end of the point.
You will see
interruptions is another thing you can look at.
Yes. And who's interrupting and how.
And who shuts them down?
Or perhaps they caveat. Structural analysis, what you'll find is a lot of underpinning a lot of, when you read examples of narrative analysis, what you'll find is people will borrow specific parts of linguistic structural analysis. In a lot of feminist, in sort of the early feminist work, you'll find when the use of narrative analysis came about, they employed structural analysis along with some of the other tools, particularly some of the kind of performative stuff that we'll talk about later, So you'll find that people will pick bits of each and bolt them together. And that's very common.
And that's fine, as long as you acknowledge why you are doing it and the implications of doing that for your ontological and epistemological position. So it's there's a lot of really useful stuff you could do, and we will talk about the challenges. I've said this twice now, of coding, because what I would not suggest you do, for example, in narrative analysis, is go through and code all the times there is conversational historic present tense, because you're not trying to feature spot here. You're usually working with a significant chunk of data that you are trying to interpret narratively. You're not just trying to, there's a great quote, who I forgot who said it now, about discourse analysis, which applies here, which is that you know, feature spotting is a bit like saying you can run a railway by being a train spotter. You know, it doesn't tell you anything about how to actually manage a railway if you just go out and write train numbers down. Similarly, feature spotting is a real risk with narrative analysis, and I don't think is particularly helpful. There may be, I mean, I'm going to caveat that by saying there may be times it's useful if you are working. In my PhD, I did an ethnography, and I worked with a group of people for quite a long time. And it would have been, I didn't do it, but it could have been interesting to understand if there were ways in which the narrative roles in a polyphonic conversation always fell to the same people. For example, if somebody was always the one to kick off a narrative or the one to close it down. So from a understanding relationality, that might have been interesting, but I didn't do it. Okay, so that is a quick overview of linguistic structural analysis. Thornborough's chapter 2023 is the chapter that I mentioned earlier in the Routledge Handbook. I'm sure it's the Routledge Handbook of Discourse Analysis. Anyway, it's on the reference list at the end and is available online. And that is a very good overview of this form of structural analysis. And certainly one of the things we wanted to do today is to signpost to quite a lot of resources. Right, so dialogic narrative analysis has some
really catchy names, aren't they?
Well, DNA, brilliant. I mean, I wish we'd come up with a method and we'd given it the acronym DNA. Draws on and has some similarities to the way I've just been describing linguistic structural analysis. So I haven't repeated the idea that that underlies this approach. Lies or originates in health psychology, but now more widely used. I'm saying that it's probably not that widely used, actually, widely cited. But because of the origin in health psychology, has a particular emphasis on the body and embodiment. Now, for me and some of my research, that ambiguous relationship with the material, as you'll see from the examples that I'm using later on, I've had an interest in sociomateriality in some of my research. And so Frank and Smith's work doesn't always deal with the material in the way I might. Very much only people can tell stories, but does advocate some form of ethnographic immersion. Now, we could also do a session on ethnography. There are many different forms of ethnographic immersion, and obviously for many people, particularly within when you've got a resource constrained research, then doing a full-blown, 12 months in the field is not going to be feasible. But there are other ways now that it is acknowledged you can do sort of more limited participant observation that might also enable you to get to this. But I do think, similar to the point on the previous slide, that if you are looking at polyphonic narrative, if you really want to get to grips with how people work together, then some form of participation is obviously helpful. I'm smiling because I'm reflecting back on a discussion with a PhD student about how tricky this is. So yeah, I which is why I'm not a huge fan of focus groups, because you don't have that understanding of the dynamics often that you get with a little bit more time spent in the field. So there are one of the reasons people cite DNA quite a lot is there are steps. Ray, there's some lists of steps in their work, and it's very much about Smith calls it indwelling, so understanding, getting to grips, familiarity with the stories, so that when someone is, and I'll use this example in a minute when we go through the examples, we were looking at railway engineers' use of smartphones, and we weren't allowed to actually go on the track, very disappointing, but we did spend quite a lot of time loading and unloading vans and sitting in signal boxes and the like, just listening to them talk and understanding discussions about different things that would happen to these railway engineers. So without that time spent with those participants, we wouldn't really have understood, being able to do the narrative analysis in the same way. Understanding the resources, some of those resources we talked about on the previous slides, and looking at who has access to them, who can talk about particular things. And here you'll start to see some connection perhaps with slightly more discursive framing of data analysis. Looking at narrative themes and structures. Now this I think is interesting, mapping circulation and affiliation. So in dialogic narrative analysis, you are, and you will see this as we go through, you're not just interested in a particular telling of a story, but looking at how and where that story might be told multiple times. In my own research, I've often found that if you are talking to a lot of people, there's not always, and it's not always exactly the same telling, but it's a similar telling. It's a similar story being repeated because it is may have taken on a mythological status in the organization, or it may be the known shorthand for talking about a particular challenge. So mapping circulation and understanding how stories are told, who tells stories about other people, who are the actors that people talk about. And the affiliation is the extent to which people associate themselves with those stories, either by the telling, by being the storyteller, or by being an actor within the story. And so in dialogic narrative analysis, you're starting to get into more complex understandings of roles and actors within narratives. You often see this in interviews anyway, where people will invoke the CEO, the time they met the CEO, or the CEO's story about something that they did, or as a way of establishing themselves as being someone who has access to the CEO, who knows about the stories about the CEO. So you often see these stories taught, or affiliation with these, as a way of positioning themselves without telling you, their official role in the organization.
We're seeing this being, we see this a lot within our own research at the moment within the sort of LGBT, trans, non-binary communities, that, and particularly when you're researching within a community, for want of a better word, we see a lot of these techniques and devices, forms of resources being employed, and so it's something to be aware of when you're thinking about researching within a particular group, a particular identity base, a particular organization or group of organizations. This can be a particularly useful framework of thinking and things to kind of look out for when you are doing your analysis.
I'm slightly wary of the time.
Yeah, I know.
Right. Okay. So that's two. So I've included the storytelling diamond because I think it's a really useful paper, and we don't have time to go through it in detail today. It's on the reference list, and what Boge's work particular is interested in anti-narrative and the way in which and analysing anti-narrative is a important aspect that some other approaches don't adopt. I wanted to include it to alert you to the paper and suggest that you read it. Because we've only got half an hour left, it would take me an entire half an hour to go through and explain Boge's theories on anti-narrative. I think it is useful. I think it is perhaps downplays some of the other approaches that we are going through today. But I wanted to include it really just to say, go away, read the paper. And it does give you some guidelines on how to locate yourself or think about how narrative would look from different positions. So then I am rather than calling this post-structuralist, I call it ish, because I'm not sure everybody on my list here would necessarily always use the term post-structuralist. And you'll see David Boge appears here again. This is an area where narrative analysis might sometimes be talked or morph into discourse analysis rather than narrative analysis. But generally, we're now looking where we're looking more explicitly at power, marginalization, and emancipation, and how that is effective through narrative. And whereas in DNA, there was dialogic narrative analysis, there was an explicit focus on embodiment, you will tend to find more attention to space, time, and materiality, and perhaps sometimes alignment with actor network theory or ANT type perspectives. Now, actor network theory is a whole another session we could run, but narrative is sort of implicit in trying to use actor network theory as a methodological tool. It's not, as one of our PhD students is discovering at the moment, not necessarily straightforward. But in actor network theory, you're very specifically acknowledging that it is not just humans that have stories to tell, and trying to map the networks and look at various ways in which stages in some way that things come to be as they are. I mean, that's a very poor summary of ANT.
It still privileges the human, though, within that as the key within the stories.
Well, let's not get into a debate about actor network theory. But essentially, if you're taking a more post-structuralist, you're ontologically going to be in a much more relativist position than perhaps you might be in the other narrative approaches. And you're looking very much at subjectivity. You're going to be looking at resistant stories, fractured sort of stories, and actors in more complex ways. And so you will also be looking at things like intertextuality and interdiscursivity, which are the ways that both specific instances of text and also more broad discourses are used and reused, and who has access to those in. And I haven't included Faircloughian critical discourse analysis in this presentation, because I would definitely position that more as discourse, not narrative analysis. But even in other forms of post-structuralist narrative analysis, you are looking at those forms of connectivity between what you are seeing in the local instance and the wider grand narratives, if you like, that might be or discourses, and how they are enrolled, or what space they create or allow for local stories. Now, interestingly, I wanted to give you a specific example of this. which does directly connect to Fairclough's critical discourse analysis, because I think it's again, I've put the reference on the list at the end, but Gimenez work looks looks at so I have some problems with this. Right at the top, you'll see there's something about analyst biased and inter-analyst check, which I disagree with fundamentally under a post-structuralist relativist position. It just isn't something that I would do. So I'm not suggesting that this is a problem-free approach. But I think what is interesting with this work, and there are in his chapter that I've taken this from, that he does work through some different steps. And I think it's quite an interesting way of looking, if you're thinking about narrative analysis, these sorts of steps, not necessarily in this order or not necessarily in this way, could be useful for thinking about what you might want to do. Now, he structures this around a core narrative. That might not be the case for many people in their research, but it does try and look at different forms of narrative. So, for example, including documents, including other forms of artifacts, as well as interviewing. So there is some look at how people talk about things compared to how they're written about in formal organization documents, which is always really interesting to look at in terms of narrative analysis, and looking at the patterns of that, and then looking or trying to connect this idea between the local narrative and the wider social or grand narratives or discourses. Now, Fairclough has a three-stage approach to discourse analysis, which includes the linguistic, the local, and this social, which is why this sort of form of narrative analysis is positioned in relation to Faircloughian critical discourse analysis. There are 100 different ways of doing Fairclough's critical discourse analysis, so I'm a little hesitant to say it's quite that straightforward. But I think it's useful to have a look at, again, including it as a means of raising awareness. Okay, so we said we'd stop briefly. We've still got quite a lot of slides to go through, and pause for questions. How are we doing on the chat for questions, Helen?
We've answered questions. We've had some people leave because they haven't been able to manage their diaries.
That's all right.
Apart from that, it's all right.
Okay, well, look, then we will encourage you to put some questions on the chat as we go through. And I'm going to move on then to the examples. These are all taken from a paper that I published with Gillian Simon last year, which is called Urgency at Work, Trains, Time and Technology. And it was published in New Technology, Work and Employment after quite a long process and having potentially been sent to other places first. So I've got 4 examples, and I am not, unhelpfully probably, pinning my narrative analysis on one of the 4 methods that I've just spoken to. It's a bit more of a composite approach that draws on different elements of it. But it is probably important to say that we were interested in time, we were interested in temporality, and we were interested in social materiality. So there's quite a lot of focus on the material in these. And I literally have picked these somewhat at random, partly because they're my favourite stories from the paper, because hopefully they'll give you some insight into, these were all from interviews. There were like 46 interviews in this data set with different types of people in the railway engineering world. Some were actually out on the track, others were in offices, and then we also interviewed senior managers. So I'm not going to give you the full background and all that. You can have a look at the paper. So we were interested in urgency. What I've put on the slides, not that I'm expecting you to thank you, not that I'm expecting you to read the analysis here, but I wanted to illustrate that when you're presenting narrative analysis in a paper or in anything really, that the analytic work is quite significant. you are actually presenting the narrative and then unpacking it. So this is actually in a published paper, and there is more analysis than the quote. This is not the Sorma method where you can just list quotes and then move on. In fact, I would argue that no method, no qualitative analytic method should allow you just to list quotes and move on. But you have to do the work to show the narrative. So through this analysis, I mean, you can see that what we do is we talk about how this is a particular instance of a reproduction narrative. So we talk about urgency narratives in the paper, and there's a reproduction of that here. Everything we go to is urgent. But then we talk about how that becomes problematic. And this is a good example of that recounting, where Win here is saying, you know, the problem is you have to wait for other people. And he reports this conversation. Oh, I haven't got the tools for that. I need to go back and get them. It's going to take me another hour. So this is a classic, as we've already talked about. This is recounting, this means of bringing someone else into the narrative to evidence your claim, and it carries more weight narratively than just saying, I'm always waiting for people to get there, which he always does. So, and you can see a little bit through the analysis, and you can have copies of these slides, how we explain that and the problem and the temporality that's going on here. Temporal junctures is the sort of temporal concept that we deal with in the paper. Okay, so that's the first example. Example number 2 is one of my favorites from the paper. So in example number 2, we've got Celia, and Celia's going, I woke up and I think I had 36 emails and a voicemail. So she's starting this story straight away. It's a great opening to a story. I woke up. It's a little bit like Once Upon a Time. She's telling us the story of her day. And she's immediately getting to the crux of the story. I had 36 emails and a voicemail, and my smartphone hadn't rung. And then she tells the story of how this isn't her fault. This is the smartphone's fault, because she's tested it. She said to her other half, she's enrolling her partner, can you just ring just to make sure it's working? And behold, this is a real revelation in this narrative. Behold, something's happened. I woke up and we'd had a signaling failure, and she'd been on call. And for whatever reason, it didn't ring while I was asleep. And I spoke to control, and so she's reenacting this whole story. I'm really sorry it didn't ring. And they were like, it's all right, it's not a problem, it's all fine now. So this whole construction of urgency. And here we were particularly interested in this fragility of the smartphone, the material in this story, and how the failures of both the signals and the smartphones are constructed in her story. So it's how she shifts the agency here to the smartphones. It's the smartphone's fault. It didn't ring. And so that was really important to us narratively in this analysis, to look at how the smartphone told of its own failure. It had 36 emails and a voicemail, and also had messages and whatever else on it. So that's the second example. Here's the third example, which again, you can see in the narrative here. We've got two narratives going on. They're nested narratives here. So Helen is telling us this story of yes men. So in order to illustrate this story about these yes men who are always responding to the directors, she then nests in this general story a specific story. And she obviously named a colleague, which is not done here. She's explaining how she looks at something and says, yeah, fine, I'll deal with that later. And then her colleague starts, have you looked at it yet? Have you looked at it yet? And that's a classic narrative tool that you can use. She's infantilizing her colleague in this, positioning herself as much more sophisticated. Yeah, fine, I'll deal with it later. And she's rebranding the sort of, are we there yet? Are we there yet? Childish narrative by calling it, have you looked at it yet? Have you looked at it yet? And she said, and I'll say, I'll do it later. And then she's corroborating this first story where she presented herself as more sophisticated by calling in the story to the director. Actually, I'm doing this today. Is it okay if I do that for you tomorrow? And he says, yeah, fine. And my colleague's still panicking. So you've got a complex narrative going on here where there are reinforced and nested narratives, and also those sorts of devices in terms of within a narrative, it's fine to use things like, have you looked at it yet? Have you looked at it yet? As a narrative device. But she doesn't have to say, I think he's childish. And she has called him a yes man, but she hasn't and said she's panic. But she's able to do things narratively that perhaps might be a bit risky to do without those narrative tropes that she can call on. And then the last example, I should warn you now, I think we're probably going to overrun a little bit from 11:30. The last example here is one of those classics where you hear it in an interview where someone is pulling in an actual classic fairy tale, and you're, you know, those of you who do research a lot will know your heart skips a beat when you're in an interview and you hear something, you go, oh yes, that one's a golden nugget. So here Shrang is talking about, I mean, temporally, this is also great. At the end of the day, none of us are actually that important. The trains are going to run after every single one of us is gone. So there's a whole different temporality brought into her narrative here compared to all the stuff about urgency we've been getting. People have cried wolf too many times. So using a classic narrative like The Boy Who Cried Wolf, you know, a classic fairy tale, is able to just throw it in because we all know that story. We all know what she's saying here. And now I just don't succumb to it, because even so, the person is saying, I want it yesterday. I actually think they don't need it yesterday, so they can wait for it. And of course, temporally, this is classic because you can't have it yesterday. That's impossible. So she's actually setting up a narrative here where she is mocking almost the claim that someone says, I want it yesterday. Because it's an impossible thing. So I realize we've run through those 4 examples quite quickly, but hopefully what that will do and is give you some examples of how we worked with narratives. These are, as I say, interviews, they're dialogic interview narratives. They all brought their smartphones into the interviews, so that we would call them material interviews, I guess, in the broader sense. And we all looked at things on the smartphones in the interview. But what you'll see across these examples is that even when you get to a paper, you are providing a lot of evidence of your narrative analysis as you present it. You're not asking the reviewer, importantly, or eventually the reader, to do the narrative analysis by just presenting a quote. Too often when I review papers, people are just listing extracts and they're asking me as the reviewer to do the analysis to get to their claim. And with narrative analysis, it's really important to make sure that you are evidencing what it is about these narratives that you are conceptually drawing on. And you can see in these as well that we're paying attention to the narrative. It isn't just about the topic of urgency. We're explaining how urgency narratives are constructed and used. How are we doing for questions, Helen?
Fine for questions.
Are we managing them all on the?
We are on top of it.
Thank you very much. Whoever we is, thank you very much. But you've got some slides now.
Narrative.
It is a narrative. You've got some slides now, I think.
I do. So I will whiz through these just in the I'm going as kind of time is
you want to swap
short.
places?
No, I'm right. So I think key points, which a lot of these we've mentioned throughout the session so far, that the point I think just to kind of reiterate on is the analytic work that needs to take place with using something like narrative. You need to make sure that depending on what framework you choose, depending on what approach you choose, your ontological and epistemological positioning is really clear, and also there's a clear link between them. So often I see papers and read papers and review papers which do not put their position clearly, or their chosen framework of analysis does not meet their positioning, the positioning of the paper. So that's kind of a bit of a plea, really, to really think about your own positioning of the research, and whether the narrative and the approach to the narrative that we've been through today fit with that. And remember, each approach will have a slightly different positioning. Also having a thorough understanding of narrative concepts. I mean, I don't, minds must be blown today in that, you know, we think analysis quite falsely, probably because of the kind of thematic analysis safety blanket we all sit under, that it is a series of sequential steps that we take, we go through them, and we've done our analysis. But when it comes to something like this, it can be a challenge to get a thorough understanding, and also the literature on it can be quite convoluted and quite difficult to access. But the first point of call is to when you pick an approach, read the authors, you know, read around narrative analysis broadly, the different approaches, just to gain a bit more of an understanding before you tackle it. And then the final point I'm just going to jump to really is the importance of reflexivity. So when you're collecting interview data, you know, in our interview session, we talk about this. You as an interviewer, the questions you ask will frame the responses that you get from your participants. This also is part of a narrative in and of itself. So some of the data, and thinking of that way when you are collecting your data, is really important. So what role do you have in framing the narratives that you are, that the participant is producing and you are consuming, you know, in the discussion kind of discourse language? So thinking about your role and yourself and your own stories in relation to research is really important. So that then leads to talk about, we've talked about coding a few times today, but all qualitative research arguably starts with forms of coding, and coding generally looks the same across at that level across most qualitative analytic frameworks. Mostly you start by looking for patterns or interesting, you know, points of contradiction, sometimes some linguistic points in your data, particularly if you're looking at more kind of structural, linguistic structural approaches. But generally you'll find there's some similarities across that. The key point that we want to make here is that generally, if you're doing a narrative approach, no matter what, there are things that you must consider at the coding stage, which you would not normally consider if you are just employing a thematic coding approach, an thematic analysis coding approach, that you are looking specifically for those narrative elements within your data at this stage, and you are mindful of that. Even when you are thinking about collecting your data, you're mindful about that point. So this is where the tools you choose at the coding stage have a real importance. So we've mentioned here around NVivo. I'm not the greatest fan of NVivo. I know you have used NVivo, Katrina,
but I am not a fan.
And this is really because of how we think it can impact the kind of coding stages, particularly when you're using these kind of approaches. It tends to give you a false sense of security in that you are just sort of picking codes, and you've got your codes, and then you can put them into some sort of nice organized framework, and off you go. Woohoo, put some illustrative quotes in, analysis, job done, tick. You know, it's not as simple as that, and quite rightly it shouldn't be as simple as that. So if you choose to use these kind of organization tools, and that's what they are, they're organization tools, they're not analytic tools. You know, they do not do your analysis for you. You are you do that work, not NVivo. So I just want to kind of reiterate that it's an organization tool. You know, if you want to organize huge amounts of data or multiple transcripts, and put your code books that you've kind of constructed on there, fine. But in terms of using it as part of your analysis, we would absolutely recommend to move away from thinking of it or even utilizing that kind of software for that.
So I will say that we used NVivo in the project from which the examples that have I've pulled today, but it actually took me quite a lot of work to go back to the data after we'd done a first round of coding. Once we decided that urgency and materiality was going to be a focus, I actually had to go back to the raw data and pull out, I mean, I did code it in an Vivo, but they were significant chunks of talk about urgency. They weren't, well, as you've seen, they're not 1 or 2 lines, they're whole stories, whole segments, and work through those narratively. So I think that is the other thing, is that this tendency in NVivo to go and code a few words or a line here and a line there, that isn't going to get you the narrative chunks that or the stories that you're really going to be interested in. You're usually dealing with, and obviously those were cut down for in the paper, but so for example, that story, Celia's story about the phone not ringing overnight, I think was about a page in the actual transcript. So so it requires a slightly different approach to it too.
And that also, just as a final point, and we'll bring this up again when we talk about interviews, because you have to allow, particularly if you're coming and using narrative and discourse, even some kind of, at the other end of the spectrum, the phenomenological, allowing space for you to get that data, that's a skill in and of itself in the research collection process. And particularly if you're collecting data from participants and you are looking specifically at narrative, you have to allow that narrative to take place without interrupting it. But if you do, then I would expect to see that in within your analysis, the way that your questions are framed, or interrupted or disrupted a narrative in a particular way.
Yeah, absolutely. If an interview is dialogic, it involves 2 people, you'd certainly expect to see 2 people in the narrative. It wasn't in those quotes I showed you, but I think elsewhere in the paper, there is an example where I'm talking, and that's certainly something that's important. Oh, this is me again. So I think we alluded to this at the start, and I put these pictures in just to illustrate some different things that I've done research about. So some of you will know Barbie, who's actually pinned to my wall at the moment, done research about entrepreneur Barbie, the railway example, these people walking down. This is a stock image, but this is exactly the sort of work they did. The Helen Mirren picture is taken from the Pirelli calendar, which I've also done a paper on. And that picture is some time ago, pre-lockdown. That is a picture of us in a pub with Maggie and Cara building Helen's PhD out of Lego. So this idea of material narratives, of visual narratives, I think is really important. And particularly if you are looking at data that is, for example, documents, I think it's difficult now conceptually to argue that if you're looking at an annual report, for example, and analysing what it says, that you're only looking at the text and you're not looking at the images. Or that if you're looking at online data and the stories that are being told, whether it's news or social media or anything else, or an organization's website, that you're only looking at the textual data, that you're not also looking at the images. So I think that is something that I would encourage you to look at. Multimodal research, which tries to look at text and image and voice and sensory data, is really challenging. And I'm not suggesting that, therefore, necessarily that you go the whole hog in the research that you're undertaking, but certainly to be alert to this. So we are coming to the end, just slightly over time. So we've thrown a lot at you today. We probably could have done this with 3 sessions, but there we go. It's the first time we've done a session on narrative analysis, and some feedback, certainly whether that's via email or on the chat now, in terms of how you find the session, would be very useful, because we don't have everybody's details, so it's a little difficult to go back and ask you after the session's closed. We went through the challenge of understanding narrative, and we hope, if nothing else, that this session has really driven home that it is not straightforward. It's just not something you're going to tag on at the end of an analysis. Oh, I'll look at a bit of narrative. And we've talked about this challenge at looking at narrative stories, discourse, and other sort of communicative modes. Certainly, I think there is more increasing overlap between narrative analysis and discourse analysis, and yet there are some discourse analysts who would, be very shocked at me making that statement. We then walked you through at a high level through different types of narrative analysis, and I realised it was slightly rough to going through those examples. But I think if you certainly look in your own fields and find what looks like a good narrative analysis, it can be really helpful to just go back and read a good narrative. Sorry, it sounds like I'm saying mine's a good narrative analysis, but find a good narrative analysis that you can hook onto and look and see what sort of the finished product looks like can be really useful. So we promised you a reading list, and we're not expecting you'll be able to read all that, but we will post these slides on our blog for you to have a look at. I'm going to let that skip forward that time. It's maybe it's set up as anyway. The other 2 sessions that we've got coming up, you've got a little bit of time to think about whether you'd like to come to those. We've got research interviews, which will actually be opportunity to practice. We get to role play as well, which we always enjoy. And we will talk about doing that specifically online. And then we're going to go back to basics and look at data coding. We did the narrative one first because our own PhD students were interested in looking at narrative analysis. So it might seem that we're doing these in an odd order, but there was method to the madness. And this is really starting from, we are going to focus on interview coding and the sort of generic approach to reflective thematic analysis, which is often a starting point. We would probably argue that it shouldn't necessarily be your final port of call, particularly in a big project like a PhD, but we'll also introduce you to this open source macro, which we have discovered and not developed ourselves. I don't know if we've got any more slides. Oh, we've got a survey out, qualitative survey out. So go back to the survey page. So we can, we'd be very interested if any of you would like to complete this or share it through your networks. Again, it's out on our blog. We only launched it last week, so it's in its very early stages, based on the research that we've been doing and built up very much from our 28 interviews that we've done so far, now taking this further into a qualitative survey. And you can find all the details by following the nice pink QR code. Ooh, we've gone back to the beginning. Maybe this has got some weird QR code on the top left there, and the nice turquoise one on the top right takes you to our Instagram account. And we will hopefully you will have got details of our blog in any case, but that is where we will be posting the slides for the session. When I post the slides, I will probably take out the detail of the extracts and just give you the reference to make the slide pack a little bit shorter.
I put a link to I put a copy of the paper in the
Oh, that's very kind of you.
chat.
Thank you very much. So we are 11:35. 5 minutes
bad.
for us. That's not bad.
That's not bad. We've been known to go on for hours.
I'm just going to stop the recording now.